Sudan is emerging from decades of economic sanctions and isolation under former President Omar al-Bashir, who was ousted by the military in April 2019 after an uprising. As of 2019, Sudan's total debt was at least $50 billion, according to the International Monetary Fund. The country is still working with its creditors to reconcile its debt up to the end of last year, and officials say the final total could be as high as $60 billion. A transitional government appointed under a military-civilian power-sharing deal is trying to pull the country out of a deep economic crisis, with inflation at over 300% and shortage of basic goods. Sudan has built up huge arrears on its debt, but has made rapid progress towards having much of it forgiven under the IMF and World Bank's highly indebted poor countries scheme. This allows Sudan access to cheaper international financing. What reforms are taking place in Sudan? Is anything starting to pay off? And what does the future hold for the country? Today, we're looking at Sudan's promising economic reforms. I'm Tolulokwe Adileru Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Now joining me from Nairobi, Kenya is Ken Kichinga. He's the chief economist at Mentoria Economics. Now, Mentoria is a business analytics consulting firm that develops successful business strategies for companies across the continent. They use a wide range of macroeconomic data and research to do their work. Ken, welcome. This is your first time on Business Edge. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with this. Not many people would have known the extent of Sudan's economic situation before Omar al-Bashir left, and it was afterwards that a lot more information came out. So just paint a picture for us. What was the country's economic indices? What was the economic situation as of 2019 when Omar al-Bashir was ousted by the military?
Well, it has been a very difficult history for Sudan, not least it being the largest debtor to the IMF and the Bretton Woods institutions. Obviously, its currency has significantly lost value, and even prior to the COVID pandemic, has faced challenges on its growth trajectory. Now, what's interesting is when you look at Sudan of the 1960s, it was actually growing at a very fast rate, at about 46% in terms of GDP per capita. In the 1970s, it did extremely well. It was growing at 170% in terms of GDP per capita. Then the challenges really began in the mid-70s, the mid-80s, when the country changed its economic principles. And we've seen really a decline of Sudan over the last quarter century. So the reforms you've talked about are controversial. There have been protests on the streets because the price of bread has gone up, the price of fuel has gone up. A lot of people still have not yet bought onto these new principles, but there is a fundamental desire to really have Sudan be the breadbasket that it can be, because in those previous years of success when I talked about, Sudan really produced enough food, not only for itself, but was able to export to its country. So if Sudan can use its vast, large of arable land to be the breadbasket of not just Africa, but of the Arab world, then I think we might see the revival of a new Sudan.
Okay, so right now we're hearing that Sudan's debt is about $56 billion, depending on who you talk to, saying it could go as high as $60 billion when everything is totaled. Let's talk about the composition of this debt. There's international lenders, bilateral lenders as well, private creditors as well. What's the composition of debt that Sudan holds?
Well, obviously, the largest has to be with the Bretton Woods institutions of the World Bank and the IMF. And that is on the cards of being forgiven and to reduce, coming down to about $30 billion, which is considered slightly more manageable, although still quite high by developing country standards. You do have bilateral debt coming from countries such as China, And China has been largely very interested, and not just part of its Pan-African strategy, with the growth of Sudan. Then, of course, you do have a bit of commercial debt to independent commercial banks. So, but the bilateral, the multilateral loans indeed are the extent that really needed to be reduced for Sudan to be viable moving forward.
All right, so Sudan is now signed up to the World Bank and IMF initiative of the heavily indebted Poor Countries Initiative. So there are some questions around the takeoff dates and, of course, what it means for the completion of the program. But in terms of debt relief, where does this HIPC come into this? And in terms of that, do we see debt relief giving Sudan access to fresh resources to be able to solve some of its economic problems?
Well, it's an extremely controversial policy. IMF policies, not just in Sudan, but across Africa, have been a bit controversial in the sense that they introduce what they call the structural adjustment programs, which tend to be extremely painful. And Sudan had those back in the 70s. Kenya had those in the 90s. So they're not extremely desirable package, but it appears to be the only way for countries to be part of the international community, which is sort of like the prime creditor to most countries. But there is still a big desire to have these countries to be able to try and to be self-sufficient in some ways. Particularly if you look at the importation of most of Sudan. Sudan is a net importer of food, yet it's still the largest exporter or the third largest of things like cotton, of sesame. So you have this incredible irony of countries that have huge potential still being net importers of food. Until that dynamic is changed, I think it's going to be pretty difficult moving forward.
Okay, so it seems since 2019, when the Transitional Council took over till now, there has been some progress made. Sudan has won. Let's say he has warmed the hearts of some of the international community, and we're really seeing people sort of step forward and step up for Sudan. But this came because of reforms. Now, we will talk about the burden placed on the Sudanese people later, but what reforms internally have been happening in Sudan for the IMF, for the World Bank to be offering some credit relief or some debt relief, for France to be offering some aid, for other countries to step up and say, okay, we're going to forgive to a certain level. What's the work being put in Sudan?
No, that's an excellent question. And indeed, it's one that's been doing the circles within our policy conversations. What has been suggested is that cooperation of power between the military and the civilian power, number one. There was a whole normalization of ties with Israel that had been also a condition. Then there was the fiscal deficit, being able to streamline Sudan's finances. I think those were key three, but one would argue that some of those things had already been underway, and the reason it's really been fast-tracked right now has been because of the changing geopolitics in the world, and that is not something that we can rule out. So I think the nature of global geopolitics has put Sudan in a particularly important place, and we are seeing foreign powers willing to be able to negotiate new terms of reference because of the global changing geopolitics. Again, I said Sudan has a huge amount of minerals and reserves, has a huge amount of arable land, and any country that is thinking geopolitics will want to take Sudan more seriously. So I think this is an avenue in which Western powers are realizing it's important that Sudan is part of the global conversation, because if it's out of it, then the situation might be very different and very unpredictable.
And it's interesting you go down that line, because I had a question towards that, and I'll still want to just sort of lead into that as a follow-up. So Sudan has cleared its arrears to the African Development Bank through a $425 million bridge loan provided by Britain, Sweden, and Ireland. This also opens up new funding, including an immediate grant of some $207 million. we've seen the United Arab Emirates agree to supply Sudan's full requirements of petroleum products through a contract with the UAE's state oil producer. We've also saw at the Financing African Economy Summit that French President Emmanuel Macron also gave Sudan $1.5 billion in aid. And so the question there at that point was, this is a lot of aid, this is a lot of goodwill coming towards Sudan. You don't always see this extended to other African countries. And the question I had for you was there something more behind it? But now you've answered it in terms of geopolitics. But doesn't this also mean we have to be very wary? You've made reference to the SAP programs under the World Bank and the IMF and some of their programs recommended for African countries to be able to have access to loans. Shouldn't Sudan also be wary of what will be recommended to them for them to access or to have debt forgiveness, given the history of some of these organizations and countries in the economies of African countries?
You're absolutely spot on. In fact, that last part of the role of France in these, I think, is a major theme that needs to be understood much further. You're right, Emmanuel Macron has been a big champion, and not just for Sudan, but for a lot of East African countries, including Kenya here. And that's something that we have to observe more closely. Now, obviously, Sudan understands its might. It's a big country with a potentially big economy. It badly needs to get people out of poverty. So it's most likely is going to use any avenue to try to do this. But you're right, it will be wary in terms of some of the conditions that come through these structural adjustment programs, as I said, have been controversial in the past. And Sudan obviously will try to be careful to see how to negotiate. But the world we're living in right now is a world where there is multiple interests at play, and nation states have to be able to navigate using some sort of dexterity to be able to deliver higher quality standards of living. So I think it's a good thing that Sudan is part of the international community. It's going to have voting rights within the IMF and such institutions. But you're absolutely right. It also has to understand why these goodies are being thrown in its favor. It's not out of benevolence, but it's part of a greater picture.
All right, Ken, let's hold on here. I like how you end that. Why Sudan is getting these goodies thrown at it. It's not out of benevolence. When we come back, we'll talk on the security situation. Then we'll also touch base with where Sudan's economy is right now and how much the Sudanese are carrying for these reforms. This is Business Edge. This is still Business Edge, and we are, of course, looking at Sudan's promising economic reforms. My guest, Ken Kichinga, Chief Economist at Mentoria Economics, is joining us from Nairobi, Kenya. Now, Ken, we've also seen Sudan negotiating or dealing with separatist groups as well as rebels, and there's an impact that this definitely will have on the economic situation. So what do you think of these moves in light of how it could impact Sudan's economic fortunes going forward?
Well, the overall theme is that Sudan needs peace, prosperity, and stability. And that part, stability, speaks to the security situation, not just in Sudan, but in the Horn of Africa. Remember, there's a lot happening within the Horn of Africa, and Sudan is a big player in that. First of all, there's that whole issue of the Nile being able to, with Ethiopia building that massive dam, that will affect water going up to Egypt. So there are all these issues that are playing out, and that's why I say Sudan is increasingly being looked upon by Western powers as a potential ally in a very difficult environment. And that is possibly one of the reasons why we are seeing these overtures towards the country.
Okay, so Sudan has a new financing arrangement with the International Monetary Fund, and that's the extended credit facility, which will anchor what the authorities are working on in terms of policy and reforms for the HIPC decision point and completion. Do you think we can get to a point where Sudan will get full debt relief, and what would it take for Sudan to get there?
Well, I don't think there'll be full debt relief, but I suspect there'll be a significant drop in debt. I also expect that the ability of Sudan to generate foreign exchange will be looked at. Oil obviously contributes to about 80% of its export income, but there are many other sectors such as cotton and sesame that will be looked at. So I think all these things will be looked at the lens in terms of how much can Sudan bring in terms of dollars from its export potential in terms to be able to justify its balance of payment. So I think that's possibly going to be the biggest focus moving forward.
So there's an important meeting coming up for Sudan next month, and that's the Paris Club of Lenders. They will be meeting to decide what they will extend to Sudan to formally agree. Now, we know that Sudan owes the Paris Club about $19 billion, and they'll decide on the portion of the debt that it will forgive, but we're hearing that that could be around some 70%, and a comparable agreement is also expected to apply to other creditors subject to individual negotiations. What do you think is going to come out of this Paris Club meeting for Sudan?
Obviously, the Paris Club is a fairly informal setup and has been negotiating not just with Sudan, but with many sub-Saharan African countries. That said, the big elephant in the room is China is not part of those conversations. Yet China is playing an increasing role in not just in Sudan, but in those other African countries. So I think there will be that desire by the Paris Club. As I say, there's a big interest in a new reopened Sudan. And there'll be those overtures to try and make it Sudan a bit more Western oriented. So we could see a significant slash in Sudan's debt, at least in the medium term, but that still will come with particular terms.
Okay, Ken, I think for some reason you're muted. Can you quickly just check your audio there? We lost you at that last part. Because I do want to touch base. I'm still struggling to hear you. I do want to touch base with how things are going with the Sudanese people in terms of them having to be the ones who bear responsibility for the reforms that the country is experiencing. I really would like Ken to be able to get an answer to that. So let's see if we have Ken back. Ken, are you back with us? All right, so we've been looking at Sudan's promising economic reforms. The country is coming out of years of mismanagement and rule under Omar al-Bashir, who was ousted in April of 2019 after protests. And surprisingly enough, or maybe not, those protests were sparked by an increase in bread prices. And at that point in time, the Sudanese people said no more. So he was ousted, and there was now set up a military and civilian council that was working together. Now that council has put a number of reforms in place, has done a number of interesting economic things, but now there are people bearing the burden for this. So Ken, let me ask you about this. Sudan's economy remains quite fragile. Some would even say still extremely fragile. We're just about 2+ years down or away from the ousting of Omar al-Bashir. Inflation is over 300%. There's a shortage of basic goods as well. It was in February that the country fulfilled one of the main conditions demanded by international donors when it unified its official and black market exchange rates. You also had a situation where electricity, fuel, and bread have become more expensive in recent times. You also have a shortage of commodities that has persisted or even worsened in Sudan. And at the end of the day, it is the Sudanese people who have been bearing the burden of these reforms. So I would hope we can get Ken one more time so that we can talk about that in terms of, is there any relief coming the way of the Sudanese? They're bearing the reforms, the economic burden of these reforms, fuel shortages, electricity is intermittent as it may be, food shortages and high prices as well. How are they doing in this situation? Unfortunately, it's looking like we will not be able to touch base with Ken finally after having such a fantastic conversation looking at the situation in Sudan. And it's also said that Sudan must also demonstrate that it will achieve macroeconomic stability and improve governance. and that it has used the new fiscal breathing space given by creditors to reduce poverty. The country cannot fall back into arrears on its remaining debts for the relief to be made permanent. It's also crucial for Sudan's overburdened government, which inherited reserves at less than a week's worth of imports from the Bashir regime. The country routinely struggles to import fuel, causing frequent power cuts. And the IMF estimated in April that Sudan needs more than $7 billion in external financing over the next 2 years. So at the end of the day, the question will remain, what does the future hold for Sudan? 6 months down the line, where will the country be? Debt forgiveness, new loans, new resources, new access to financing. Those doors will be open. So before the end of the year, what could 2021 look like for the Sudanese? I will still say a very big thank you to Ken Kijanga for joining me from Nairobi, Kenya. We look forward to having him back talking about the politics, both geo and non, coming out of the Eastern African region. This is Business Edge. We'll take a quick time out. Up next is NC4 to watch. Now, as we wrap up the show, let's give you a few stories we're keeping our eyes on. KLM's only representative in Kenya Airways board has resigned, and the Kenya Airways announced the resignation of the only KLM representative on its board. Joseph Barnedos Venstra stepped down from the Kenya Airways board during the company's AGM on the 25th of June. Now, KLM Royal Dutch Airlines currently owns a 7.8% stake in Kenya Airways. They previously had 26.73% of the national carrier, but after a debt restructuring program in November 2007, that fell. Moving on, the rehabilitation of the poultry industry, which has set local producers and importers on a collision course, has already created 4.7 billion rand of growth in the industry and over 1,200 jobs since early this year. Local producers said the growth excludes benefits in the feed manufacturing industry, grain industry, packaging industry, and other sectors, as the targets of lifting the GDP from 48 billion rand in 2019 to an estimated 54 billion rand in 2022 is in sight. South Korea is investing in energy-related projects on the continent. Now, this is a follow-up from the Korea-Africa Energy Investment Framework Pact that was signed in May. The African Development Bank, the Korean Ministry of Economy and Finance, and the Export-Import Bank of Korea signed the agreement in which Korea will provide $600 million in co-financing for energy projects alongside the African Development Bank. And finally, the Law Union and Rock Insurance Limited have changed their name to the Tangerine General Insurance Limited following the receipt of the required approvals from all relevant regulatory authorities. The company said in a statement that this was in line with an earlier acquisition by Virod Capital Management Limited through the Virod Capital Growth Fund 3. And that's it on Business Edge. Don't forget that if you've missed any of our interesting conversations on political, economic, financial, and of course, business stories from here on the continent, head to our website. You can take us with you wherever you go. Just download News Central's mobile app on your Play Store and App Store. And of course, watch us live on YouTube. And we're streaming 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on our YouTube channel. But you can also watch us live on StarTimes channel 274. I'm Tolu Lokwe Adileru Balogun. I'll see you next time.